Hey guys, it is April from Getting Hooga With It. I don't know if you're anything like me, but when I read a book that I adore, I always go on the hunt online to try and find books that are kind of similar to it, books that have a similar vibe. And sometimes I'm successful and sometimes I'm not, but I wanted to do my own rendition of that here. So it's kind of a, if you liked this book, I think you'll like this. So if you are up for that, keep on watching and let's get into it. So first up, I want to talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Rebecca is such an atmospheric, mysterious book about a woman who's working as like an elderly woman's companion, and she goes on this trip with this woman and she meets this man named Mr. De Winter. He quickly proposes to her and she says yes, and she moves with him to Manderley, where he lived with his first wife who died. And now she is the new Mrs. De Winter, and she moves in and she just doesn't feel quite welcome. The servants there really loved the first Mrs. De Winter, and she feels constantly compared, and she begins comparing herself to the first Mrs. De Winter, and she kind of becomes obsessed. But this is an incredibly atmospheric book. I felt like I was at Manderley when I was reading it. And what I would suggest that you read if you liked Rebecca is Tangerine. Tangerine is a new release and I absolutely loved it. This is set in Tangier. I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong. But this is also incredibly atmospheric. It's set in a kind of desert kind of place, and you could feel the sand all over your clothes when you're reading this book. And this is another mystery kind of book where we follow our main character named Alice, and she moves to Tangier with her husband, and she kind of is trying to get away from her old life. One day she's at home and an old friend comes calling named Lucy, and she knocks on her door, and Alice should be happy to see her old friend, and yet there are some layers there. Lucy and Alice were once very dear friends at college, and then something happened that really put this edge into their friendship. It kind of ruined their friendship. And here Lucy is again. Things start happening when Lucy shows up, and Alice doesn't know what to do with her friend Lucy. Now, Tangerine was written by Christine Mangan, and she studied Gothic literature, and you can really see it. You can really see it in this book, and I really, really enjoyed it. So if you liked Rebecca, I think you'll like Tangerine. By the way, I should mention Tangerine is set in the 1950s, which is so rare for a thriller. I don't know if I would call this quite a thriller. It's really like Gothic literature. It really is like a Gothic romance. So yeah, that was a lovely little surprise. I find a lot of thrillers and that kind of thing are set in present day, and I personally love to have a throwback. You know how much I love historical fiction. So yes, if you liked Rebecca, head on over and read Tangerine. The next pairing I want to talk about is It by Stephen King. It follows a group of young kids, and it kind of switches back and forth from the 50s to the 80s. In the 50s, they're kids, it's summer, and they stumble upon a presence that is trying to kill all of the kids. Children in this town are going missing. They're trying to solve what is happening, and they're trying to fight it. It goes forward into the 80s, and in the 80s we follow them. One of their friends in this little group dies, And they had all agreed that if anything goes down like that, they were all going to go back to their hometown and try to fight it again. It's definitely a fun read. It's really long, so I struggled with that. I also find Stephen King really wordy, and I really struggle with that. But what I really liked was what brings you back to being a kid. Like, he was able to get into the mindset of kids in a really great way. I felt like I was a kid again. It brought me back when I was reading it, so I enjoyed that. What I would suggest that you read if you liked it is The Chalkman by C.J. Tudor. Now, this is a fairly new release, and this was great. This follows another group of kids, but in the 80s, and we're following them through a summer break. And they have this like little, not a game that they play, but kind of a language that they've created for each other. And so it's essentially they create chalkmen and write chalkmen at the end of each other's driveways. And that tells them, hey, we're going to go to the park today, meet us at the fair, whatever. And one day they see these chalkmen at the end of their driveway, and it leads them to the woods where they find a dismembered body. Now this interweaves all sorts of things. The children, their stories interweave with the adults in the storyline as well. So their parents, there's a teacher that we follow, and everything kind of interweaves in this lovely way. But it reminded me so much of it. The way that C.J. Tudor kind of gets into the minds of kids. If you aren't ready to dive into the, 1,300 pages of it, The Chalkman is a lot shorter. And it gives you a hint of what you could expect in it. So I definitely recommend The Chalkman. Another book pairing that I've got set up for you is Boreal Rites. I feel like everyone has read Boreal Rites and loved it. It's such a quiet, another very atmospheric book about a woman in Iceland. She's been charged and convicted of murdering a man, and she is just waiting to be killed. They're waiting for a guillotine to arrive in Iceland because they don't have those readily available. And in the meantime, she's working with a family on a farm, and these people start to interact with one another in this really interesting way. And it was just such a quiet story, and you're trying to get into the mind of this woman and what actually happened. Did she actually kill this person? I personally loved this book. I also loved Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood, and it's very similar in terms of the storyline. This takes place in Canada. It's based on a true story of a woman who was convicted of killing her boss as well as his mistress, and it dives into her storyline and whether she actually did it or not. And in this book we are following her. She lives at a prison, but she also works for this family, so she gets to leave the prison every day and like do chores and stuff at this family's home. And she meets with a doctor as well who is trying to help her out and also investigate what happened in this scenario. And I as soon as I read Boreal Rites, I immediately started thinking of Alias Grace because I'd read Alias Grace first, and they seemed like they're sister books. If I can go that far, I would say they're sister books. The next book that I personally really loved is The Good Daughter by Karen Slaughter. She's such a great author. This book is part thriller, part family drama. It was so interesting. It starts out with a bang. We follow two storylines, past and present. In the past, we're following this family and a horrific incident that completely changes their family's life. And we also follow another storyline later on about a mass shooting. So this last storyline brings one of the daughters back home, and everyone is together again, and they need to sort through their own emotions about these horrible events that have happened. I don't want to give too much away about that one because it's such a lovely little onion that you get to peel back. But what I loved about this thriller was that it wasn't only a thriller. We were really diving into a family and sorting through the emotions that this family goes through and the relationships that they have with one another. And I ended up falling in love with all of the people in this family, and I really loved that. Now, what I would compare this to is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. Now, Dark Places is not quite as family drama-esque as The Good Daughter, but it most definitely has that element in here. In this book, we're following a young woman whose entire family, except herself and her brother, were murdered. Now, her brother is in jail for having murdered the family, and all of this time, she's told herself that he did do that. But then she starts to think it through a little bit more, and she's wondering whether he really did kill this family. Is he innocent or not? So she starts to unravel the past, unravel the relationships that she had with her sisters and her mother and her brother as well. And I just loved a layered thriller. And so I think if you liked The Good Daughter, you should try to pick up Dark Places. So those are all of the books that I have for you. I hope one of these books calls out to you, and if so, let me know in the comments below which one calls out to you the most. I would love to know, and I will talk to you guys next time. Okay, bye!